The call came 3 days after we buried him. I watched my wife's face change as she listened to the voice on the other end. Her jaw tightened. Her knuckles went white around the phone. I'd been married to her for 12 years, and I'd seen her angry maybe twice. This was something different. This was a cold fury that made the air in our kitchen feel 10 degrees colder. She wasn't crying. Emma had done enough crying for all of us. My wife's sister-in-law had just lost Daniel, her husband of 8 years, and the grief had hollowed her out like a carved pumpkin. Emma moved through the house like a ghost, touching Daniel's things, his favorite chair, his reading glasses still on the nightstand, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table. Her daughter Lily, only 10 years old, kept setting a place for him at dinner out of habit, then dissolving into tears when she remembered. Daniel had adopted Lily when she was 2. Didn't hesitate, didn't make a big deal about it. Just said, "She's mine now," and that was that. He showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every dance recital, every scraped knee and bad dream. He was her dad in every way that mattered. The man had been the glue holding our entire extended family together. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every random Tuesday when someone needed help moving furniture or fixing a leaky pipe, Daniel was there. He'd show up with his toolbox and that easy grin, stay until the job was done, then hang around to help clean up and share a beer. He remembered everyone's birthday without Facebook reminders. He brought bourbon to family gatherings and told terrible dad jokes that somehow got funnier every time. He made my father-in-law laugh, which was no small feat. He made Margaret, my mother-in-law, feel like she'd gained a son, not just a son-in-law. And then his heart stopped. No warning. No dramatic chest-clutching scene like in the movies. He'd been at the gym, doing his usual morning routine. Just collapsed on the treadmill. By the time the ambulance got him to the hospital, he was gone. Massive heart attack. He turned 50 exactly 1 month earlier. We'd thrown him a surprise party. He'd laugh until he cried when we all jumped out and yelled. The funeral had been standing room only. People spilled out of the chapel into the parking lot. Co-workers, neighbors, guys from his softball league, the barista from his favorite coffee shop, his mechanic, people I'd never even met who had stories about how Daniel had helped them, changed their lives, made them laugh when they needed it most. One man stood up and said Daniel had talked him out of suicide 10 years ago over a cup of coffee and never mentioned it again. Just checked in on him every few months to see how he was doing. Emma had sat in the front row, staring at the casket like if she looked hard enough, she could will him back to life. Lily pressed against her side, both of them shaking with silent sobs. Margaret held Emma's other hand, so tight I thought bones might break. Daniel hadn't made funeral arrangements. Why would he? You don't plan for death at 50. You're supposed to have decades left. Grandchildren, retirement, time. But about 3 weeks before he died, he'd been helping Margaret organize some old family photos. They got to talking about the family cemetery plot, the one where Margaret's parents were buried, where Margaret and my father-in-law George would eventually rest. It was in a small, well-maintained cemetery about 20 minutes from town. Old trees, quiet, peaceful. Daniel had said something like, I kind of like the idea of that, being part of the family even after, resting next to you guys someday. He'd laughed, made a joke about it being morbid. Margaret had patted his hand and said there was always room for family. It was the kind of conversation you have when death feels theoretical, distant, something that happens to other people, old people, sick people. Not to Daniel, who ran 3 miles every morning and could still beat his teenage nephew at basketball. When the unthinkable happened, when we were all stumbling through the nightmare logistics of funeral planning, Margaret didn't hesitate. She told Emma that Daniel should be in the family plot, that he'd wanted it, that he belonged there. Emma, barely functioning, just nodded. She couldn't make decisions about what kind of flowers to have at the service. She certainly couldn't handle debates about burial locations. So that's what we did. That Friday, under skies the color of concrete, we buried Daniel in the family plot. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Emma's legs gave out when they lowered the casket. George and I had to hold her up. Lily threw a drawing she'd made onto the casket, a picture of the 3 of them holding hands under a rainbow. The sound of her crying was the worst thing I've ever heard. We went back to Margaret and George's house afterward, the usual post-funeral gathering. Too much food, nobody wanted to eat. People speaking in hushed voices. Emma sat on the couch, staring at nothing, while people offered condolences she didn't hear. Margaret moved through her own grief to take care of everyone else, because that's what Margaret did. George stood in the corner, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. I thought the worst was over. I thought we could start the long, terrible process of healing. Then, 3 days later, the phone rang. My wife answered. I was making coffee, trying to function on 3 hours of sleep. I heard her say, "Hello, Diane," in a neutral voice. Then silence. Long silence. Then her voice went flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before. "Say that again," she said. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Diane was Margaret's cousin. Second cousin, maybe? I'd met her twice at family reunions. She was in her mid-60s, a medical educator at the local university, well-respected in the community. She had that air of authority some academics get, like she was always lecturing, even in casual conversation. She'd never been particularly warm, but she'd never been hostile either. Just distant. She lived about 40 minutes away and showed up to major family events, stayed for an appropriate amount of time, then left. My wife's face was doing something I'd never seen before. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. Her eyes had gone hard. He was Margaret's son-in-law, she said into the phone. He was family for 8 years. She stopped. Listen, her hand started shaking. A stranger? You're calling Daniel a stranger. I put down the coffee pot and moved closer. We just buried him, my wife said, her voice shaking now. Do you have any idea what Emma is going through? What Margaret is going through? And you're calling to complain about? She pulled the phone away from her ear. I could hear Diane's voice, sharp and angry, but couldn't make out the words. My wife stared at the phone like it was a snake. Then she hung up without saying goodbye. What the hell was that? I asked. She looked at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, angry tears. Diane is upset that Daniel was buried next to her grandma. She says he's not really family, that the plot was meant for blood relatives only, that Margaret had no right to offer it to a stranger. The words didn't make sense at first. I had to repeat them in my head to process them. Daniel was Margaret's son-in-law. He's been family for 8 years. He adopted Lily. I know, my wife said. I know. And apparently that doesn't matter to Diane. She wants to move. I felt something hot and sharp rise in my chest. Moved? She wants to dig him up 3 days after we buried him. She's calling it a family matter that needs to be corrected. She said Margaret was too emotional to think clearly and made a mistake. I sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs. Is she serious? She can't be serious. But she was serious. The next call came 2 days later, this time to Margaret directly. I wasn't there, but George told me about it later, sitting in his workshop with a glass of whiskey, his hands still shaking. Diane had called Margaret and doubled down, said that the family plot was for blood family only. That Daniel, no matter how nice he'd been, wasn't really Margaret's son. That it was inappropriate for him to be buried there. That Margaret needed to fix this mistake before it became a bigger issue. Margaret, George said, had gone absolutely still on the phone. Then she'd started speaking in a voice he'd never heard from her in 45 years of marriage. Low, control, furious. Daniel was my son, she'd said. He was more family to me than some people who share my blood. He showed up. He cared. He loved Emma and Lily with everything he had. And you dare call him a stranger 3 days after we put him in the ground. Diane had tried to interrupt, but Margaret had kept going. Emma is destroyed. She's barely eating. She's barely sleeping. Her daughter is having nightmares. And you're worried about cemetery politics? You're worried about who has the right to rest next to your grandmother, who you visited maybe twice a year when she was alive. There had been more yelling on both sides. George had taken the phone from Margaret because he was worried about her blood pressure. He told Diane to back off, that this wasn't the time, that Daniel was staying where he was. Diane had hung up on him. We thought that was the end of it. We thought even Diane wouldn't push further. We were wrong. 4 days later, Emma received a letter from a lawyer. Diane and her sister Carol were preparing to file a lawsuit to have Daniel's remains removed from the family plot. They claimed that Margaret had exceeded her authority in offering the plot, that the cemetery spots were family property held in common, and that the burial of a non-blood relative violated the terms of the original plot purchase from 70 years ago. Emma called my wife, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. My wife drove straight to Emma's house. I followed 20 minutes later. Emma was on the couch, the letter crumpled in her hand, Lily hugging her and crying too, neither of them understanding why someone would be so cruel. They want to dig him up, Emma kept saying. They want to take him away from me again. I can't do this. I can't bury him twice. My wife held her while she cried. I sat with Lily, who asked me in a small voice if bad people could make her daddy go away, even though he was already gone. I didn't know what to tell her. I said no, that wouldn't happen, that we'd protect her daddy. I hoped I wasn't lying. That night, my wife and I sat in our living room in silence for a long time. Finally, she said, "This can't stand. This can't happen." I know, I said, but I don't know what we can do. If they actually file the lawsuit. Margaret gave permission, my wife said. It was her plot to give. The lawyer Emma talked to said the lawsuit probably won't succeed, but it could drag on for months, maybe years. Emma would have to fight it the whole time. She'd have to go to court and defend her right to have buried her husband. Can you imagine? I couldn't. The cruelty of it was staggering. There has to be something we can do, my wife said. She had that look in her eye, the one that meant she was planning something. Over the next week, she had several long, quiet conversations with Margaret and George. They'd meet at the house, close the door to the study, and talk for hours. I wasn't included, which was fine. I trusted my wife, and I trusted that whatever they were planning, it was necessary. Emma knew something was happening, but she was too deep in grief to ask questions. She was still in that stage where getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, where every song on the radio made her cry, where she'd forget for a few seconds that Daniel was gone, then remember, and the loss would hit her all over again like a fresh wound. 2 weeks after the lawsuit threat, Margaret called a family meeting. Just the core family. Me, my wife, Emma, George, and Margaret's brother Robert, who'd always been close to Daniel. Margaret stood in her living room, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen her, but with steel in her spine. "George and I have made a decision," she said. "We're moving Daniel, and we're moving my parents too." Emma looked up, confused. "Moving them where?" "We own 40 acres about 15 miles from here," George said. "Land that's been in my family for generations. Beautiful spot. Trees, fields, privacy. We're creating a new family burial site there. A place for people who actually loved each other, who actually showed up. It's going to cost a fortune to exhume and move 3 people," Robert said quietly. "Some things are worth any price," Margaret said firmly. "I will not have Daniel's resting place turned into a legal battleground. I will not let Diane and Carol weaponize my grief and Emma's grief for their petty power play. So we're removing the problem. We're taking our family and going somewhere they can't touch." Emma started crying again, but this time with something like relief. "You don't have to do that. I don't want you to spend." "It's done," Margaret said. "The papers are already filed. The exhumation permits are approved. It happens next week." My wife caught my eye and gave me a small nod. This was the plan. This was the revenge that wasn't quite revenge yet, but I could feel something else coming. The following week, we held a small, private ceremony as Daniel and Margaret's parents were moved to their new resting place. It was beautiful. Rolling fields stretched toward distant hills. Tall pines swayed in the breeze. There was room for everyone who mattered. Margaret and George would be buried there someday. Emma too, if she wanted. Lily, all of us. Daniel's new grave was under a massive oak tree. Emma planted flowers. Lily left more drawings. It felt right in a way the cemetery plot never had. This was family land. This was home. We didn't tell Diane and Carol what we'd done. We didn't call to gloat. We just let them find out on their own when their lawyer contacted the cemetery and discovered the plot was empty. According to Margaret's brother Robert, who still talked to some of the extended family, Diane had been furious. She'd ranted about the expense we'd gone to just to spite her, about how we'd overreacted, about how she'd just been trying to preserve family tradition. But here's the thing about Margaret and George's land. The thing we hadn't mentioned to Diane. The thing that was about to become very, very relevant. Diane's property, the house she'd lived in for 30 years, was landlocked. The only road access to her home ran directly through Margaret and George's land. It had been that way for decades, long before Diane had bought the place. It was an easement, a courtesy extended to family. Margaret's father had granted it to Diane's father back in the 1970s with a handshake and a promise that family took care of family. That road was the only way in and out of Diane's property. Without it, her house was effectively inaccessible except by hiking through the woods. One evening, about a month after we'd moved Daniel, George mentioned casually over dinner that he was planning to till under the old road that spring. He wanted to expand his soybean planting. He was building a new access road on the opposite side of the property, much more convenient for the farming equipment. The new road would be nowhere near Diane's property line. My wife had looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes. Does Diane know? George had taken a sip of his beer. Haven't gotten around to mentioning it yet. Been busy. Grieving, you know. Margaret had said nothing, but there was the tiniest smile at the corner of her mouth. I'd realized then the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about moving Daniel. This was about consequences. The easement I'd started was never formally recorded, George had said. It was a family courtesy, a handshake agreement between my father and her father. But Diane made it clear that Daniel wasn't really family. That blood is what matters. That courtesies extended to family don't apply to strangers. So if Daniel wasn't family, my wife had said slowly, then Diane isn't either, Margaret had finished. Not in any way that matters. Not in any way that obligates us to maintain a road we don't need on our private property for her convenience. The beauty of it had taken my breath away. The absolute poetic justice. George had continued. Now, legally, she might be able to fight for the easement. Might argue prescriptive rights, continuous use, that sort of thing. Could take years in court. Cost her tens of thousands in legal fees. And she'd have to prove that the easement was necessary and that we're blocking it in bad faith. But we're not blocking anything, Margaret had said sweetly. We're just farming our land, making improvements, building a new road that better serves our needs. Nothing personal. Nothing personal at all, George had agreed. They hadn't told Diane yet. Spring was still 2 months away. driveway. The road would be tilled under for planting in April. Diane would find out when she came home one day and couldn't get to her house, when her driveway suddenly led to a plowed field. But that wasn't even the best part. My wife had been doing some research. Quiet research. The kind you do when you want to understand exactly how much damage you're capable of causing. The cemetery plot situation was even worse for Diane than we'd thought. The original plot had 12 spaces. Margaret's parents had occupied 2. Daniel had occupied 1. That left 9. But here's the thing about cemetery plots. They're valuable because of proximity. Because of context. Diane and Carol had fought to keep Daniel out because they wanted to be buried near their grandmother. That was the whole point. The prestige, the sentimentality, the family connection. With Margaret's parents gone, the plot had lost most of its meaning. The grandmother's grave was still there, but she was now surrounded by empty spaces on one side and distant relatives Diane barely knew on the other. The family grouping was broken. The whole reason the plot mattered was gone. Even better, the 3 graves we'd moved had been positioned in a way that made 6 of the remaining 9 plots either difficult to access or poorly positioned. The cemetery had rules about spacing, about access paths, about which plots could be used in which order. Moving 3 graves from the middle of the arrangement had essentially made half the remaining plots worthless. Diane had fought to control a cemetery plot that was now functionally useless to her. She'd spend eternity far from her grandmother, in a half-empty section of the cemetery, surrounded by strangers. Exactly what she'd accused Daniel of being. My wife had smiled when she'd explained this to me. Not a happy smile, a satisfied one. She wanted to play games with something sacred. She wanted to turn grief into a power play. Now she gets to live with the consequences. But my wife wasn't done, because my wife understood something important about revenge. The best revenge isn't violence or vandalism or dramatic confrontation. The best revenge is letting someone destroy their own reputation. She started telling the story, not loudly, not on social media, just quietly when asked, in conversation. When people inquired about how Emma was doing, about how the family was handling Daniel's loss, my wife would mention, almost as an aside, what Diane had done. It's been hard, she'd say, especially with a lawsuit threat. Can you imagine? 3 days after the funeral, calling to complain about where he was buried. People were horrified. Of course they were, because the story was horrifying. And Diane wasn't just some random distant relative. She was a respected medical educator at the university. She taught ethics to nursing students. She served on hospital boards. She gave talks about compassionate care. Everyone in our mid-sized community knew her name. Many people had taken classes from her. She had a reputation for being principled, moral, compassionate. That reputation was built on sand, and my wife was bringing the tide in. She didn't embellish. She didn't exaggerate. She just told the truth. Diane had threatened to sue a grieving widow to have her husband's body removed from a family plot. That was the story. That was all the story needed to be. Word spread the way it does in communities like ours. Through church groups and book clubs and hospital break rooms. Through parent-teacher organizations and coffee shops and the grocery store. People talked. People were shocked. People reassessed what they thought they knew about Diane's character. My wife would hear things secondhand. A colleague of Diane's had mentioned at a meeting that it was interesting how someone who taught compassionate care had shown so little compassion to her own family. A former student had posted something vague on social media about being disappointed in a former mentor. The hospital board had apparently had some concerns raised about judgment and interpersonal conflicts. Nothing dramatic, nothing actionable, just a slow erosion of reputation, a quiet questioning of character, the kind of damage that's impossible to fix because there's no single thing to address, no dramatic accusation to refute, just 1,000 small conversations, 1,000 moments of doubt, 1,000 people thinking, maybe she's not who I thought she was. Diane had no idea. Not yet. She'd won in her mind. She'd stood up for family tradition. She'd made her point. Daniel was gone from the family plot. She'd probably already forgotten about it, moved on to whatever else occupied her time. She didn't know about the road. She didn't know about the cemetery plot's diminished value. She didn't know that her reputation was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. She'd find out about the road in April when spring planting started. She'd drive home from work one day and find her driveway leading to a freshly tilled field. She'd call Margaret and George, furious, demanding they fix it. They'd politely explain that they'd built a new road, that they were expanding their farming operation, that the old easement was no longer convenient for them. They'd suggest she might want to talk to a lawyer about establishing a formal easement, though that could take years and cost quite a bit. She'd realize then what she'd lost, that the family courtesy she'd taken for granted for 30 years had been exactly that, a courtesy, one that evaporated the moment she decided Daniel wasn't family. she'd probably try to apologize then. Try walk it back. Claim she'd been emotional, that she'd overreacted, that she hadn't meant for things to go this far. But some things, once broken, can't be fixed. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. And by then, her reputation would be in tatters. She'd be the woman who tried to sue a grieving widow. The ethics professor who showed no ethics. The family member who turned a funeral into a legal battle. Emma was healing. Slowly. The way you heal from an amputation, not a cut. Learning to live with the absence. Learning to breathe through the pain. She visited Daniel's grave every week, sometimes with Lily, sometimes alone. She'd sit under the oak tree and talk to him. Tell him about her day. About Lily's school play. About the hummingbird that had built a nest near the porch. The new burial site had become a place of peace. Margaret had planted a garden around the graves. Roses and lavender and daisies. George had built a bench. We'd gather there sometimes, the family that mattered, and share stories about Daniel. The time he'd accidentally set the grill on fire trying to impress Emma's coworkers. The time he dressed up as a princess for Lily's birthday party. The time he'd driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help my wife's brother move apartments. Diane wasn't part of those gatherings. Diane wasn't welcome. Diane had made her choice about what family meant, and we'd made ours. My wife doesn't gloat. She doesn't brag about what she's done. But sometimes, late at night, she'll look at me and say, "He's at peace now. That's what matters." And he is. Daniel rests in a place chosen with love, surrounded by family who wanted him there, who fought for him even after he was gone. He's under an oak tree on land that's been in the family for generations. Land that will stay in the family for generations more. Lily will be able to visit her father forever. Emma will be buried beside him someday, if that's what she wants. That's the story that matters. That's the ending Daniel deserved. The other stuff, the revenge, the consequences for Diane, that's just the epilogue. The natural result of choosing cruelty over compassion, of weaponizing grief for a power play, of forgetting that family is built on love and loyalty, not blood and burial plots. Some revenge is loud and immediate. A punch in the face, a screaming match, a dramatic confrontation. This revenge is slow, patient, permanent. Diane will realize what she's lost when she needs that road. When she has to park at Margaret's new access point and hike half a mile through the woods to reach her house. When she has to explain to lawyers why she thinks she's entitled to use someone else's private property.